Oh, welcome to another Focus workshop. It's my pleasure, honor to introduce Mark the Greater. Mark Correll is professor of history at Spring Arbor University. He is also president of Senate and head of the history department at SAU, among many other things that he is. He'll be talking today about portraits of liturgical change. I'm not sure how long he will speak for, but there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So save your questions and you'll have a chance to ask live, or you can post them in the chat. Everybody make sure you are muted, and I will turn it over to Dr. Correll.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just go ahead and make sure for the recording that I have got my own mug on here. So thank you, and yeah, I will admit that when the topic of liturgy first came up for this year's focus, I was a little bit confused as to what would be a good way to try to take on this particular topic. I love to be able to be take part in this. When then I guess sort of sitting down and feeling like I could explore and arrange a little bit and think about liturgy in our practices, liturgy as ritual, liturgy as repeated actions, it began to dwell on me that actually I felt like I could use a number of little historical portraits to discuss how people's behaviors, how their rituals, how their engagements in the world end up actually creating these liturgies of our societies and liturgies of our world. And I just this past month have finished a book or read a book. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. It was a book that I had thought that I ought to read ever since I was in college, and I only finally got around to reading it. And it's a fascinating attempt on the part of Eco, who's an Italian author, to try to set something in the Middle Ages as a way to try to appraise what do we think as priorities in our own world. It's a murder mystery and set within this monastery, and the people who are there are engaging in medieval frameworks of thinking, medieval frameworks of mind. And of course, this also connects to kind of Catholic theological frameworks of mind as well. And so one's not particularly surprised, but in the end, liturgy ends up being a really huge portion of this particular book. Even the ways in which the chapters are organized are based on kind of time sections and time frames based on the liturgical clocks of the day, or the liturgical hours of the day. Likewise, there's a really big theme, ends up being something of a red herring that's really tied around sort of seeing liturgy enacted in murder. And so we have these really kind of fascinating engagements with this liturgical thinking in the Middle Ages. And I think if we were to, and this is gonna not pick a bad time to do that, and if we were to sort of think about liturgy and liturgical practices, we're not surprised when we get to the Middle Ages. But one of the reasons why I think Eco's book has been so powerful, why people have continued to read this book since it was written in 1980, is that because it's constantly connecting. If I could ask you to mute, please. It's constantly confronting, constantly engaging with concepts of how we engage our time and how people did back then, and how we think of ourselves as better today, but maybe we're not that much better after all. So in any case, let's try to define liturgy in the first place. So again, at a real narrow definition, liturgy is quite specific. So from the Oxford English Dictionary, they define liturgy as a form of public worship, especially Christian, a collection of formularies for the conduct of divine services. And so in this sense, it seems to be just these Christian practices and Christian rituals that you would find within churches in order to engage in particular in the particular worship service. But I'm going to use actually a more sociological interpretation of liturgy to begin to try to engage in this, which is this, which I'm borrowing from Emile Durkheim, who is kind of one of the founders of sociology, who really defines and says that what religion does, or religion's purpose within a particular society, is to declare that which is sacred or taboo away from that which is everyday. And I find this really useful because what liturgy ends up being is liturgy are those symbols that we use, that we engage in, those rituals that we use and engage in to declare time, space, and age as part of God's story. So in essence, liturgy are those moments where we declare that which is secular, or that which is secular and that which is divine. And so it's within the engagement of these practices that we start to recognize and situate ourselves within our particular world. So my first example that I'm going to draw from is indeed from the Middle Ages. And I want to try to describe a little bit kind of medieval society and how it fits well with this kind of conception of liturgy. So of course, within church services, there's always a liturgical practice that you had, always running through these different orders of the Mass and these different steps of the Mass. But liturgy also spilled out, and these religious definitions began to also spill out into the everyday life of a typical medieval person. So liturgy was used in order to dictate time. Like I said, the times of the days, the times when people stopped to pray, the times when people ate, the times when people worked, these were all defined within the time of the day through liturgical practices, connected to biblical stories, connected to worship services, connected to times which people engaged with God. The same thing happened actually also in terms of the entire calendar year. So that in a medieval calendar, of course, every Sunday is a sacred day, is a holy day. And then on top of that, there are about another 40 holy days during the year where somebody was expected to take time off of work, to feast, to celebrate, to remember. And these oftentimes dictated really or structured, set a framework for the medieval person to really consider the movement of their days, or the movement of their seasons and of their years. So harvest was oftentimes connected with the saint's day of Saint Michael, right? The archangel of Israel. Or you had Midsummer's Day was connected to Saint John the Baptist. Of course, wintertime and the darkest time is with Christmas, and then spring is Lent, Lent and planting, and then feasting at Easter. And so not only the days hours were set up through a liturgical orientation, but also the time and experience of life was set up in a liturgical sense, always connected to these moments of holiness, to these moments of connection to the divine. Space too was engaged in a particularly liturgical and a particularly worshipful orientation and through these rituals. It's not maybe necessarily connected quite so much, but it was probably on a particular feast day. The young people of the community, the children, would basically be led around the outskirts of the manor and around the outskirts of their own family's land. And they would be cuffed, right? They'd be hit, literally physically, right? In the kind of conditional learning, right? In a kind of Pavlovian sense, to learn where the boundaries of their land was. And so this was called beating the bounds, and they would just go around and they would hit their children to learn what their space was. Likewise, people learned that there were particularly holy spaces, right? As you walked into the church, you behaved differently than when you were walking out to the latrine. Or even when you were walking into the marketplace or when you were walking to your fields. There are certain places, right? So even geography, even the map of the surrounding areas was defined by those areas that were particularly holy, where one would come to engage with God, and those areas that were taboo, ones where you were not allowed to go, and then areas in the middle that were just kind of everyday life. The third way that liturgy really helped shape medieval society is in terms of age. Liturgical rituals were connected at the major milestones of a person's life. So when somebody was born, they went through the process then of baptism. They found then on their naming day, they were given a name, usually of a particular saint, that was given on the day of the feast of that saint, rather than on their birthday. So that saint's day actually was more important to them than their birthday was. They would go through and they would enter into the church with First Communion and get their basic training. Then they would meet the next milestone when they got married, and the church was present there. When women had their first, when they had their child or their children, they would then go through a process called churching, where they would return back to the church. Finally, they would die and they would be buried, all under the liturgies of the church. And so the church dictates their daily time, their annual time, their calendar. The church dictates their space and their surroundings. And this liturgy also dictates even their ages of life and their experiences through life. And so we see in medieval society, a society that was very intentional about its engagement with liturgy, and very intentional in its liturgical understandings and its definitions of itself as a religious society. And so on the one hand, I think that we have some real things that we could benefit from looking back at that and remembering that this intentionality has certain benefits to it. That indeed, at those particular milestones, one was called back into worship to God. One was called back into relationship with God. In those particular celebrations and in those ceremonies, one was reminded that there are times when God is present and God is close, and to embrace those particular times, those moments. And so this liturgy, right, to use again another kind of psychological concept that from of scaffolding and scaffolding learning, this liturgy, in essence, what it does is it takes the chaos of space and it takes the chaos of time and it puts benchmarks in there, it puts posts and marking posts in there so that one knows exactly where one is and knows exactly when one is. And from there can begin to create greater order and greater stability and greater sense of self, even in the midst of this chaotic surroundings all around us. I do think, however, that liturgy, even at this point, was showing that it has a kind of dark side. So I'm going to appeal once again to Echo's book, The Name of the Rose. Ritual also announces things as being sacred, but very quickly ritual can turn into being something simply rote, where we stop remembering, right? You maybe don't recognize this as much as somebody who's my age and has had my experiences. It's very hard for me to remember which Christmas I gave my children or I gave my wife this particular gift, or what gift I received, or what experiences we did. Because in some senses, the rituals that we built up around Christmas, those liturgies of family, the liturgies of the memory and thinking on the incarnation, those liturgies of kind of the understanding the sacredness of Christmas, because we engage in them at the same time, sometimes instead of me paying closer attention, or instead of us paying closer attention, we end up paying less attention. Those create a kind of parentheses, right? I walk into church, the liturgy starts, my brain just goes on autopilot. I say the words I'm supposed to say. I sing the words that I'm supposed to sing. I listen to things that I'm supposed to, and then I walk out of the church and I realize I haven't paid attention to a single thing that's going on, simply because it's so familiar that it stops being something truly special. And Echo's book deals with this a lot, as basically many of these monks are engaging, have stopped seeing the transcendence and the meanings behind the rituals, and instead the rituals have just become this kind of this thing that is part of their, that they run through, and they run through the motions without necessarily engaging with them in any deeper sense. So this is the strictest, right? That I'm going to move away then from when we move away from the medieval age, away from the strictly religious oriented liturgies. But I want to talk about how these liturgies and these changes of practice really do end up creating an entirely new outlook and entirely new engagement with the world. And so I want to start first talking about political revolution. Now, actually, I've talked about both of these political revolutions in previous focus talks. One was from 3 years ago, one was from 2 years ago. So I'm not going to go into but I still find them really evocative for us to kind of think through what does it mean to have engagements with rituals, engagements with the scaffolding that shares the community's virtues and so forth. So revolutions are something that happen actually with surprising frequency in history, especially in modern history. So really, since the American Revolution and the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, we've had revolutions after revolutions. Many countries have multiple revolutions. Some countries or some areas of the world have these huge waves of revolutions. But these revolutions are disruptive. And historically speaking, that's the most important aspect of them, is the fact that they disrupt the world as it was before, and they force it to change. Now, some of these political revolutions are very intentional about this. And probably no political revolution was more intentional about this disruption of traditional rituals and rites than the French Revolution, that from 1789. So the French Revolution from 1789 until 1799, when Napoleon took over power, engaged in all kinds of very explicit attempts to disrupt and to dismantle the liturgies of the Catholic Church and to replace them with liturgies of the secular state. And so they went through the process of breaking down this concept of time. So instead of having the calendars and the saints' days that had dictated, especially the peasantry's life up until this point, they got rid of that, instead changed the entire calendar to being one that they saw as being more rational, where every month had just 30 days, and then they had sort of 5 extra days at the end, where the months were named not after Roman figures or Norse gods or the various things that we do, or connected in any way to kind of religion, but instead just simply they gave them these kind of agricultural names. Whatever the kind of season was, that was the name then for that particular month. And the hours also, they attempted for a while to change the hours of the day and the days of the week, wanting to make everything more rational, turn it into a metric system where everything was based on series of tens. And this was ultimately, in terms of time, not particularly successful. That the calendar of France went back to its traditional names and traditional hours and counting once the radical revolution was overthrown. But it was at least this attempt, logically, to say, what is it? What are the virtues of our society that we want to try to use these rituals in order to express? And how do we put those then into these practices? So let's change our calendar. Likewise, they stopped having celebrations of holy days, instead turning into celebrations of secular holidays like Bastille Day, like and these celebrations then of explicitly non-religious calendars. Right. Again, the United States is one of those countries that has done this really effectively. And the fact that if you're working, probably the only religious days that you get off of work are probably Christmas and Easter. And otherwise, you have all the rest of the holidays that you're going to get off are secular days celebrating the nation to some degree or another. So space and time was changed and challenged, and these rituals of the French Revolution forced the people to question what they saw as being valuable, what they had inherited, the kind of the learning and the logic of the old system, and forced them to challenge it and think in terms of a new one. Another revolution took place in 1919, and this was in Germany. World War I had just come to an end. Germany has a revolution that overthrows its king, and that overthrows the king, and they lose the war. They surrender in the war. And here the government was not particularly intentional about trying to create any kind of liturgical ritual changes in their days, other than adding elections. And here, though, this chaos created a kind of vacuum. Without those liturgical benchmarks, people could no longer really orient themselves to saying, well, what is actually an important day? What is the actual important measuring points of our life? What is the important space that we hold? And into this vacuum then came all kinds of attempts to try to fill it. In fact, one of the great philosophers of the era, Martin Heidegger, wrote a book called Space and Time, where he was an existentialist and he's kind of thinking about that and trying to wrestle with it. And in the end, he really says, what we need is we need somebody who's bigger than all of society to be able to dictate for us what is sacred space and what is sacred time. And so it was pretty unsurprising that Heidegger then jumped on the Nazi bandwagon when it came in, because in that chaotic nothingness, the lack of any kind of liturgical orientation, somebody like Adolf Hitler was able to step into that chaos and able to create then benchmarks and standards for himself. This is a sacred moment in German history, and this is a sacred place in German history, and this is a sacred age and time. And so Nazis were much more effective at rebuilding those liturgies that had been lost because of the political revolution. But maybe the most important revolutionary changes in the orientation and the development of liturgy over the past 300 years wasn't through political change, but rather through economic change. So I want to talk instead about the liturgical changes then that came about because of industrialization. So industrialization was felt for the people who were living through it like a fairly slow process. But certainly if you had been born in 1770 and had lived, at least in England, until 1830, the world you lived in would have been a very different place. Even more so, if you had lived from, say, 1815 and died in 1900, the world would have been a considerably different place. And I need you to understand how incredibly disorienting this would be for the typical person. Really, from 1750, or people who were living their lives in 1750, probably lived more like people who lived in the Roman Empire, or more like people who lived maybe even in the Assyrian Empire or biblical Middle East, than they do like people by 1900. Their lives before 1750 were dictated by the church, but dictated also by agricultural seasons, right? And the church and the agricultural seasons reinforced each other through these liturgies in these times. Industrialization changes all of that. So that now, at least by the end of the 19th century in Western Europe and the United States, the majority of people are no longer living out in the countryside, and they're beginning to start to gravitate towards these great cities. And an ever increasing proportion of the population is no longer working in agriculture, but is now working in some kind of manufacturing or services industry. And so then people's lives begin to be dictated in entirely different ways. So instead of waking up when the cock crows or when the sun rises, now one wakes up based on an alarm clock set on a 24-hour time period. Then one starts to work, not necessarily when one has eaten and heads out to the fields and depending on the labor of the day, but rather one starts work when they punch in at the clock. And so time is radically reoriented away from the rhythms and the breathing, the ups and downs of agricultural life, and instead as it's been turned into something that is rigid and exact and mechanical, just like industrialization itself. In the same way, space is reoriented in terms of industrialization. Industrialization makes the whole world a lot smaller. So that now it's possible to go from one part of the world to another part of the world in a matter of days rather than in a matter of months. And so this means then that people can go from one place to another place to another place to another place. And if you're going to have people moving from one place to another place to another place to another place, then you also need to have clocks that are the same everywhere. So you need to orient and have everybody have the exact same hours of the days, and you need to divide the entire world then into time zones, and people need to be able to set their clocks to particular moments. And so space and time both have been now reoriented. Likewise, we begin to orient ourselves much more towards our rituals. We stop being so much, who are we as far as what are our purposes and what are our beliefs? And instead we start to become, well, who are you? What do you do? Or what can you consume? And so we end up reorienting our entire lives so that for the most part, we expect to have our rhythms of our days dictated by our professional careers. So we go to work, we come home from work, we have our evening engagements, We socialize potentially with those same people. We have basically our lives then dictated by the space, the time, and by our age groups, right? Even this creation of adolescence or young adulthood, where you guys are new creations of industrialization. Adolescence came about because, well, first of all, we started to think it was unethical to have children working in factories and losing their limbs, but also because we needed to have better educated people to be able to work a more and more complex world. And then as that became even more complex, we needed to push people then into adulthood or emerging adulthood. And so that you guys are even pushing back the benchmarks, the times of your lives further back than they were even in my generation, and certainly more than they were in my parents' generation. And so this industrialization only continues to multiply its effects in terms of liturgy. One last vignette, an anecdote of liturgical change. And this is probably the most obscure of all of these liturgy vignettes that I'm giving, and potentially the least important, but the one that fits closest to my own area of expertise and knowledge, and one, though, that I think really kind of weds a whole lot of these different kind of concepts together. So going back to the Protestant Reformation, right, which starts in the 1517 and begins to really kind of pick up speed in the early 1500s. Eventually, this leads to conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in Germany in 1555. And you have, or 1553 to 1555, you have a series of wars. And at the very end, there's a peace treaty that's signed. And in this peace treaty, the two sides, the Protestants and the Catholics, wanting to try to figure out how they can stop from constantly killing each other, they make a really weird resolution to resolve this conflict. And they basically have it in Latin, it's called Cuius regio eius religio. It basically means who's the province, there's the religion. So basically, whatever the religion of the prince, of the leader of this province, theirs will also be the religion of all of the people. So if the ruling family is a Lutheran Protestant, and the people then are going to start having Lutheran pastors, they're going to follow Lutheran sacraments, they're going to follow Lutheran liturgies, and they're going to begin to do this, and it's going to be enculturated. But let's say, for instance, that prince's son, usually, maybe daughter, has decided to convert back to Catholicism. Well, when that person when the elder king dies, or the elder prince dies, the younger prince then gets to determine the religion of the province. And so it will convert back. And so once the old king dies, or the old prince dies, the new prince takes over, well, then you're going to go to church the next Sunday, and you're going to go back to Catholic liturgies. Eventually, this becomes even more complex because, of course, Protestantism doesn't stay united. Instead, Protestantism divides, and at least in Germany, divides in two major camps between the Protestants, between the Lutherans and the Reformed Calvinists. Now, the Calvinists are much smaller than the Lutherans, but you have now Lutherans, Calvinists, and Roman Catholics. None of the princes converts to Anabaptism or any of the other sects. So there are other sects running around, but they're not really, they don't have that kind of power. And so one of the funniest groups that converted to Protestantism was a family by the name of Hohenzollern, and they were the royal family of Prussia. And the reason actually that he converted was because he had actually been a monastic knight. He had been head of a monastic order, and so he was supposed to remain chaste. He wasn't supposed to have sex or have children, be married, or anything like that. So he wasn't going to pass his reign onto his son. So he converts to Protestantism. He's now allowed to marry. He marries and instead turns basically his territory into an inherited dynastic principality. That's great for him. And the Hohenzollerns come down, but at some point, the Hohenzollerns actually convert from Lutheranism to Protestantism. So normally this means then that Prussia, which by this point owns all the area around Berlin, much of northern Germany, some territories over in the western part of Germany, up all the way into sort of present-day Poland, fairly large, expansive state, should have converted to Calvinism. But the kings decided to have a mercy on their people, knowing that this change from Lutheranism to Calvinism, which probably to us doesn't seem like a super big switch, but to them it did, would be too disruptive. And so he decided just to convert the family to Calvinism, And they would have a Calvinist court preacher, where everybody else, though, would continue to follow the Lutheran liturgies. So this works for a while, and Prussia continues to grow, and the Prussia remains Lutheran until Napoleon comes along, and Napoleon really humiliates the Prussians. He defeats them and weakens them, at least while he's ruling. After his defeat, the Prussians want to come back, and they want to make their state stronger and more unified than ever before. And this includes reforms to the military, it includes reforms to the universities, but it also includes reforms to the church, because the church was paid by the government, and the church leaders were paid by the government. And so the Hohenzollern king, King Frederick William III, decides to change the liturgy of his entire province. And what he wants to do is he doesn't want to pick a side, either Lutheran or Calvinist. Instead, he wants to blend the best of the two together. And so he calls together some of the finest theological minds of his age, including people like Friedrich Schleiermacher, and they come together and they figure out how to create an entirely new liturgy that takes the best and takes elements of both the Calvinist and the Lutheran ideas together. They call this the United Church, or the Union Church. So you would think, right? It's 1817. This is already, industrialization is already taking place. You've already had these military defeats. Prussia has become a great power. It's clear that they need to unite and become a more centralized power in order to defeat the future threat from Napoleon. You would think that by this point, the minor theological differences between Lutheranism and Calvinism wouldn't really mean a whole lot, right? So whether Christ was in the Eucharist, or whether the communion was just merely a symbolic action, right? Those kinds of things you would think wouldn't necessarily matter to them anymore. But it did. There were a lot of people who felt extremely strongly about this. Some people felt that it was wrong. They were Lutherans, and there was no way that they should be watering down their Lutheranism by accepting certain Calvinist ideas. There were a handful of Calvinists who felt this way as well, but for the most part, it was Lutherans. And so they said, well, what is our church? Our church then stands upon the confessions of the Lutheran Church, the confession, the Augsburg Confession, these 16th century documents that were created by Martin Luther and his disciples. And they said they became known basically as the confessionalists, who said, we reject this change. Then you had another group of people who said, well, the change is good, but it didn't go far enough. In fact, it would be far better if we were to entirely get rid of all of these liturgies and all of these forced recitations and all of these forced language, and instead accept this kind of new modern Enlightenment thinking. Then you had the third group, the largest group, and they were like, well, it's okay. It's not going to change us that much, so we're just going to accept it. So you have three groups ranging from those people who are saying we need to go back in time to the 16th century and basically be Lutherans like that day. People who are saying the world is changing all around us because of industrialization and political revolutions and so forth. We can no longer hold to the Christian liturgies we have. And then there's a third group that says, yeah, sure, go ahead, mess around with it a little bit. We don't see any real problems with it so far. So how do you resolve then problems like this? Well, the way that they resolve it is in a sort of surprisingly post-revolutionary way. Frederick William decides then he's going to create a body, basically the High Church Council. It's going to have about 8-9 people, and he's going to appoint each of those people, but their job of those people is to represent the wishes of their provinces and the wishes of the people. And then on top of that, he's going to have an elected body called the Synod, where all the people of the church get to choose their representatives that are going to make then the doctrinal decisions for the church. So here's his idea. His idea is not to simply say, well, I'm the king, I have this power, going back to the eius regio, cuius religio. I've got that backward, cuius regio, eius religio. And he also isn't somebody who goes and says, well, we're just going to accept this as the mystical realities, as like time immemorial, the liturgies. Instead, he's somebody who says, all right, if we want to mess with liturgical change, what we're going to do is we're going to adopt these reforms that have come about really not of his own wishes from the revolutions in France, to politicize and create political parties that are going to fight and advocate for their viewpoints, to have elections that represent them. And so here we end up having then a weird system, a weird modern system where the individual German believer in this Prussian church feels like they have the right to choose and elect representatives for them that are going to tell them how they're going to come into close connection with God. That seems really normal to us in the United States. We oftentimes have congregational churches where we vote on who's going to be our elders, and those elders choose the things. But that's bizarre in terms of if you say our whole purpose of liturgy is to draw us closer to God. So what we end up having by the time these liturgical changes have taken place, we end up having then societies that have transformed themselves, that have accepted many of these outside ideas, but they're still trying to use liturgy in some ways to be able to set down those guide marks as far as what's the right space and what's the right time and what's the right age. And still trying to find some way to govern that, still trying to find some way to make sure that that the people can find their virtues within it. So where are we today? And I'm wondering if we're potentially getting to the end of liturgy. In fact, I read another book this month, and neither of these books was I reading because they were connected to liturgy. They just really fit well, though, as I began to think about it. This was a book called The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. It's a post-apocalyptic book about a world basically in which all that is known and everything that people think they know or the way that the world works has basically been destroyed by climate change and corporate greed and all this stuff. And so basically Southern California, where the protagonists are, has become essentially like Honduras today, where there's armed gangs and drug users and drug wars and great migrations of people north. And so in the midst of this world, Butler, the author, theorizes or projects the protagonist, Lauren, as a kind of religious thinker, as somebody who, instead of wanting to accept the old liturgies and the old doctrines of Christianity that she had been raised in, instead wants to deify God as change. The only thing that she sees as being real is change. But in creating then this religious orientation towards change, Octavia Butler has created, in a sense, a new liturgy for this particular community that she calls Earthseed. So it's a weird kind of thought. It's a fascinating book, highly recommend it. But it's this kind of thing of saying, what happens if we so disrupt our society that we no longer have any common consensus of what is the liturgy, what are the values that the liturgy is going to support? What do we end up having afterwards? Is it possible to recreate society out of that mess? And so I'll tell you what I think is, in my viewpoint, maybe the end of liturgy. And that's what I've just tried to come up and coined a term, the YouTubeization of engagement. I like YouTube, right? You go onto YouTube and you find videos, maybe TikTok's even better. TikTok's even shorter than YouTube videos. You go onto YouTube, you watch something that's like 3 minutes long, 4 minutes long, and then you move on to something entirely new. Because you don't want to try to engage in thought that's longer than 3 minutes or 4 minutes. You just simply want to be able to float from one thing to another because, 22-minute sitcoms are just a little bit too long for anybody's attention span. And I find myself doing exactly the same thing, right? I start watching anything that's longer than about 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and I've got my cell phone out. And I'm looking at something else at the same time because I'm constantly unwilling to re-engage with simply slowing down and recognizing here we're in a moment of transcendence, or here we're in a moment of a need to pay attention to where I am in space and time. And instead, I want to try to do all things at all times. I want to be constantly present to everybody. I want to be constantly engaged in everything simultaneously. I want to be constantly connected to everything. And I'm not sure that we can really sustain that. I think liturgy is a call away from multitasking. Liturgy is a call to focus. It's a call towards recognizing that there are certain things that are sacred and certain things that are everyday. And so I didn't find a picture of Spring Arbor's chapel, but I like to sit up in the chapel, up in the balcony when I go to chapel. And sometimes it's kind of fun to look down, because what it ends up looking like is a really beautiful light show as everybody's cell phones are kind of going on throughout the entire chapel service, because it's too long anymore to be able to say this is a time to kind of focus and dedicate. Right? And I don't want to blame anybody. I'm exactly in your boat. I just and I realize that there's sometimes that some chapel speakers speak more than others to you or whatever, but nevertheless, there is this constant drive, this constant sort of internal drive towards being in more places and not having those real clear delineations of this is a moment of sacredness or this is a space of sacredness. So those are my thoughts. I'd definitely like to hear what you think, as far as whether you think that we're in a moment or a time where liturgy is maybe, I might be missing the boat. Liturgy may be just in a sense reforming itself to something else. If you see that as something that's taking place in time, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I'm happy to take whatever questions you may have. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Correll. My internet is really unstable, so don't wait. I guess wait for me to respond to questions or whatever. I know that you can handle that. So, but wonderful presentation here. So feel free to write questions in the chat for Dr. Correll to respond to, or you can on mute. Be good if you could show yourself and respond that way. Thank you.
So I feel like it has to be said that it seems that you have, maybe I just read it wrong. It seems like you have a predisposed, like, negative view of the end of traditional liturgy, but could it be like that maybe it's undergoing more of a metamorphosis rather than like a death of liturgy, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could, right? I think there's a way of looking at society that just simply says, like, society's gonna choose for itself what's important, and it's sort of in this collective action there's going to be almost a kind of spontaneous generation of liturgy, and that liturgy in essence is inescapable, right? There will never have a society that doesn't have things that are sacred and things that are taboo or things that are just everyday. I'm a little bit, and I am very open to that being the possibility. I don't yet see for myself what that shape is or where that direction is going. Certainly if you feel like, oh no, it's definitely metamorphosizing, and there's definitely, I see it amongst maybe our generation or certain groups where you say like, oh no, there's particular sacred ground or particular sacred spaces. Right? I mean, maybe there is, right? Trying to think of recent examples. We have sorry, this is the one that just came to mind, because I'm from the Minneapolis area originally. After the murder of George Floyd this summer, there was sort of a spontaneous creation of memorial right there at the street corner where he was killed. And so there you have, in essence, right, a creation then of a sacred space. People understood you didn't go in there and treat it as you would any other street corner, at least not while the memorials were still there. So maybe that need to create some kind of social virtues and social organization is still very much present. It's a really interesting question, and certainly I'd love to hear you more, JP. I see that Nathan wrote, so would the thesis of the lecture be that liturgy has changed over time, but it hasn't necessarily gotten better? I would argue that what liturgy has a particular social function that has been, in a sense, kind of universal in all times. And I think that it oftentimes is used in order to try to express what's really important in our society. And in the sense of, is it getting better or is it getting worse? I don't know that I want to say specifically it's getting better or it's getting worse, so much as I'm just trying to say that what it does is it reflects what we find holy. And if we, as a whole, can't find anything holy, we might not have a liturgy. Or it could be that we find something that is holy, but maybe it's not the thing that we ought to be worshiping. I know this connects very well with the talk that Dr. Noble had last night. And I've been thinking about that since I heard it yesterday. Kelly wrote, thoughts on how we could revive that slowing down to ourselves and our children. Totally relate to putting on TV and scrolling on my phone at the same time. Can I open that up to anybody else? Any of you guys have ways? I think that maybe my generation isn't particularly prepared for it, because for us, all of this technology is still pretty novel. Whereas maybe your generation, your generation is a generation that's really effectively actually shut down social networking, right? Or social, right? For you guys, Facebook and Instagram, you've always known it's phony, and you go into these other. You guys have been really good at just simply saying like, well, I don't need to connect with that. I've got my other ways of staying closer and connected with my friends. I'm just going to do that. I don't know. Do you guys have any wisdom, maybe for us, those of us who are approaching middle age, to be able to think through how we stop with the kind of multitasking end of liturgy?
Super like wise words about this or anything, but I would definitely say like I put like time limits on my phone, and that helps a lot of just like, okay, if I'll maybe like 2 hours a day, just like, okay, if I've spent more than 2 hours a day, I'm just turning my phone off, or it'll have a time limit thing, so my page will just shut down. So that's nice to be like, okay, I've spent too much time on my phone, I'm gonna put that down and I'm gonna do something productive. Because yeah, I can find that you can waste a lot of time on social media or whatever else, and it's just not very productive. It can be a big time waster for sure. Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like just having that discipline of saying, okay, I'm gonna limit myself in how much time I'm gonna spend on social media or the internet or whatever else, to make sure that you are engaging in more serious topics and stuff that matters, for sure.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think the really tricky thing for me is I'm not good at discipline, right? And that's maybe, I guess, where liturgy is helpful, to simply say, okay, I'm going to go through this particular ritual. I'm going to go through this thing that I don't know, put my phone away in my dresser, and I'm just not going to look at it from this point on. Maybe, right, and that's maybe where kind of having those moments of saying like, no, this is sacred, or this is sacred time that I have with my family. I know that for me, the COVID pandemic and the slowdown has been in many ways really something that I've cherished, because I have spent more time with my kids. But because of the stress of everything else, I think a lot of the time I'm just constantly sort of trying to wrestle with, how do I make this I don't necessarily slow down and cherish that moment. Instead, it just tends to be kind of a kind of, well, it's just happening. And so I don't spend time paying attention and saying, I would have never spent so much time with my children in 1 year as I did this past year. And obviously we couldn't do a whole lot during that time to make those memories really valuable. But how do I do that, and sort of thinking that through? And maybe it's as easy, Nathan, as you said, simply slowing down and shutting out phones. There's lots of questions here. Walker wrote, as Christians, should we value secular liturgy? Again, this is something I talked about actually in the chapel, in a focus 3 years ago. I think that secular liturgy can very quickly become idolatry. I know this is something that Dr. Noble talked about last night too, right? That pretty soon, national holidays surpass religious holidays as the most important ones on our calendars. And we start to worship then the nation rather than worshiping Christ. or we worship our commercial capacities and our employment more than we worship something else. And so I think in those situations, they would say no, that in that sense of saying that is now this is now sacred. I think we've lost something as a Christian. I think that we've lost something. But I do think that it's valuable to maybe at least be aware that we engage in these rituals, and that our time, that we dictate and orient our time, and we create our mental maps based on things that, or I think we should at least be aware of what it is that we're basing it on. All right, another person wrote, over the past 15 years, the amount of people who identify with no religion has gone from about 15 to 26%. Would you compare this trend to events of the French Revolution? Yeah. I would argue, this gets more to my feelings about the church and the role the church has made. One of the other things that I know that I read an article about was just simply was how many people even consider the church a productive institution within our society, and that has also gone down, right? So you used to have even secular people say like, well, yeah, but the church does a lot of good things. They take care of the poor, they feed the poor, they feed the hungry, they clothe the naked, and so forth. And so in that sense, they still do a functioning good role. Whereas, of course, I think it's been taken over very much by a kind of, well, at least evangelicals are a political organization, and I think that is in many ways similar to the French Revolution, in that the Catholic Church had become a political orientated society, institution, a wealth orientated institution, rather than one that was sort of functioning towards the good. And so what ended up happening in both of those societies, same thing I think as was happening around 1918 in Germany, is you start having this huge credibility gap. That the church says it's one thing, but it does a very different thing. And that once that credibility gap, right, and there's always been hypocrisy within the church, right? Good luck finding a time when the church wasn't hypocritical. But in those times when the hypocrisy starts to so overshadow the actual good works of the church, you begin to start to see a pretty uniform anger and movement away from those things that the church is deemed to be holy, right? Because I think the Protestant Reformation is the same thing, and so forth. All right, still more questions coming at me. Elise wrote, would I say that the contemplative nature of liturgy is what we are losing the most, and the changes that are taking place will cause us to lose more and more? Are we in danger of losing our ability to have a contemplative attitude towards life in general? Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from you, Elise, if liturgy, how I guess what I was trying to engage with liturgy is that liturgy is by its nature communal and public. And I'm wondering how does contemplation work within the public, right? I mean, I can understand how we have times where our church simply says, for the poor, let us pray, or something like that. Right, and then we think about the people in our own lives, and we have that own contemplation, and then we do that together, and we all say, Lord, have mercy, right? And so there is a kind of inviting of contemplation, but I'm not entirely sure that we can have a liturgy that is just purely individual, which maybe goes back against my whole idea about like just trying to shut off times and so forth. I have to admit, right, liturgy for me, and just thinking in terms of liturgy is kind of trying to wrap my brain around really, really big concepts that I don't know that I'm always super successful. Danielle says, how has COVID affected our modern liturgy? Has it made it less group event and more of an individual event? Yeah, I'm still one of the people who's going to Bedside Baptist, and we're still Zooming into church, and I definitely feel I feel safer, and I feel sometimes like that's the responsible thing to do rather than making other people sick. I know I'm blurry, sorry about that. I don't know how to fix that. But I do definitely feel the loss of kind of collective, right? It's hard for me to sing a praise tune while I'm kind of lying in bed watching the TV screen, right? Just belting out a song feels a little bit weird for me. And I think that that's something that's lost, that kind of communal virtue establishment in that. And I think a lot of people have really disconnected from church, and a lot of people have said, well, I've disconnected from church and I'm not missing anything yet. And so their kind of disconnect has continued to move further and further. But I don't know. So I don't know, you guys have, this is the weird thing about doing Zoom focus. Normally I'd like to have more of a discussion and push things back to you. Everybody's asking super thoughtful questions. Right, and then Edwards has to throw that in about secularization at the end. But any thoughts that you guys are having? I don't know if you can make sense even out of this stuff that for me was, I don't know, just vignettes, just sort of associated word pictures.
Maybe to Edward's point as well, and maybe Dr. Noble touched on this last night. I wasn't able to go, but I wonder if the kind of, right, so liturgy gives us the identity. It was your job. What was your ritual? What did you do? And liturgy gives you like order, meaning, some sort of definition to your life. It seems like, for better or for worse, the political parties are starting to operate that way in America. Over the summer, like, instead of going to church on Sunday, you go to the march on Friday, or you go to your whatever Zoom meeting, or about that you're bored. And if I were to place anything in that gap of what liturgy has to, or what liturgy is becoming, because like Heidi said, like, something bigger than society needs to tell us what to do. I'd say it's, maybe the political parties. And I think it's odd because it's not even, at least it's not even like a following of something definite. It's a very, like, no one really knows what they're following, but it's just kind of the group. Not to negate all of the kind of social change that has gone on with energy behind those, but yeah, I don't know. So what do you think of that, Dr. Mark, or what do you think is the new kind of liturgical identity?
Yeah, I don't want to cede it to political parties yet. Although I think you're right. I think a lot of people have taken their cues and they have said, hey, this is how we know what's right in society, and this is how we celebrate, right? And definitely you can look at like a nominating what are they called, the national congresses, the nomination parties, as they're liturgical in their orientation, right? You have this thing, then you sing together, and then you say the Pledge of Allegiance, and you do those, and you walk through all these steps, and then at the very end you have an anointing of a person, of a candidate, who then becomes the representative for them. These are all deeply religious ones, and so I would say that in that situation, yes, it has become idolatry. I think though, I think one of the things that for me was the most disenchanting about maybe the 2020 election, and probably goes back a little bit to the last couple of other elections as well, is that I think that the liturgy in my life was very much defined by like my elementary school teachers. That they were the ones who kind of said, here's what you do as good citizens. This is what a good citizen does. This is what the police are supposed to do. This is what a political party is supposed to be. This is how the president is supposed to limit his power, her power. This is how, you know, and all those kinds of things was kind of set up as like, well, this is the way that the world works, and this is the way that the state works. And then all of a sudden now we're getting people who are saying like, well, what if it doesn't, or it doesn't work that way anymore? And so I guess maybe that response is just this kind of thing of what do we do when the liturgy, again, what do we do when the credibility gap seems to grow so big, right? What do we do? What do we grab onto? What do we seek? How do we create holiness when our elementary school teachers told us what they told us is no longer seems to be true, or when our Sunday school teachers what they said no longer seems to be true? How do we create then that space? How do we dictate our lives? Because it seems so disorienting, I think, within this. So I certainly feel disoriented in the world of politics because it certainly isn't the world that it was when I was growing up. I feel very disoriented in the world of religion because I don't necessarily feel like the church is what it was when I was growing up. Which may be just because I just didn't know how to look at it right, but those are tricky things. And then Karis asked, I'm not sure if this is two opposing ideas or not, but do you think our desire for the change is and of itself a new form of liturgy? I definitely think that was the argument that, like I said, Octavia Butler in this other novel that I read, The Parable of the Sower, that she's trying to say, is that maybe disorientation itself is our orientation. I just don't know how you can build a society on that. I don't know how you can share that. That becomes much harder to grasp and hold on to. I don't know. So I certainly don't want to answer any of these questions with any kind of certainty, because I really did feel like what I wanted to present to you guys is really portraits, moments of these changes in history, not necessarily to come through and say like, oh, liturgy is always good, or liturgy is always bad, or liturgy always changes. But certainly as a way to say like, well, when liturgy does change, our way of associating with the world changes as well. And so if we are in an age of liturgical change, it may be that we don't yet know how that's going to end up with our orientation towards space and time and age. So I'll leave you guys with that really ambiguous ending, but thank you everybody for the really terrific questions and for your attention today.